Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Rajesh Bhai, for inviting me to speak on this subject, which is very close to my heart. And of course, Chamber, as usual, is my own organization, so there is no question of accepting the invitation. You have to just give a command, and I'm always available. And welcome to all the participants. Generally, I'm used to addressing, seeing the participants in front of me at the auditorium or all. This is the second only webinar which I am, addressing through this mode. So I'm used to hearing the, mobiles and somebody coughing and somebody sneezing. So I will be missing those, sort of noises. But this is the way now we have to learn the new way of interacting with people, and it is my pleasure to be here this morning on this subject. So the theme given by Rajesh Bhai, when we spoke about the contents, and his focus was on how to capture the impact of COVID in the calculations, which of course I'm covering. But we thought we'll also cover some recent developments, because this field in the recent time has gone through substantial change from the regulatory environment point of view, and that's why we thought we will cover that also. So what I intend to do in next maybe 1.5 hours is to take up basically how this like evaluation regulations are evolved over a period of time. I will also cover some basics of valuation, although valuation is a very vast subject, so I can't take it up in a great detail. But if we don't take sort of go through some of the basics of this valuation, maybe the participants will not be able to sort of appreciate some of the regulatory requirements which are coming up. So maybe it's better for all of us to go through some of the basic principles of valuation. I will not take much time in explaining the valuation as a subject, but some important points I will touch upon. Thereafter, I will try to cover some contents of the valuation report and some documentation requirement, and then we will come to the Companies Act and rules, which got introduced in 2017 and 18. And we'll also very briefly touch upon the valuation standards which our CA Institute has notified. I will also take up the draft valuers bill, which is introduced in April 2020 and which is open for the public comments. The last date of which is 28th of May 2020, by which the government has asked everyone to give the comments. And then I will take up some points on impact of COVID, how to capture in the calculations of valuation, and then we will leave the house open for question and answer through the mechanism which Rajesh Bhai just mentioned. So with that brief background, let me just go to the evolution of valuation regulation. With the next slide, please. Yeah, so it will be unfair to say that valuation was never regulated. Valuation was always regulated, I believe, because as a chartered accountant, when we were issuing valuation report prior to the specific regulation coming into force, we were governed by our own institute's code of conduct and ethics. So not that it was not regulated. What has happened in last maybe a decade or so, where there is a more focus on the valuation, and naturally it was required because uh, lots of transactions which started taking place, the quantum increased substantially, and because the crux of any transaction is the consideration, and the consideration is determined by the valuation process. So valuation became absolutely important focus point for any user of the document. So that's where the regulatory environment also changed, and now specific regulations on valuations are coming up, and I believe they are all welcome changes, of course, subject to certain practical aspects connected to those valuation regulations, which as we go along maybe will get settled. We are going through right now a phase which we can call it as a changing phase. So maybe it will take a couple of years for things to stabilize. But I think good time is ahead of us when we look at this as a profession. On two grounds. One is that requirement for valuation is increasing day by day. Uh, Earlier, maybe when I think of start of my career, only when companies were going for some mergers or sale of business or sale of shares, the valuation was getting triggered. And in those years, it was more for meeting the corporate governance requirements, and there was no specific requirements to get the valuation report obtained from a particular entity. Uh, but now when I see, if you see the current times, we need the valuation for variety of purposes, and we'll cover up it in one of the slides, that the trigger point for valuation has increased so much that the players, according to me, currently who are registered as valuers are will fall short of the requirements. That's why I think the move of the government also is to broad base this profession, and also invite some other uh, professionals who will be eligible to carry out the valuation. So to that extent, we are going through this phase, which is changing the entire environment. Now, if we go to the history of how valuation regulations got evolved, you will see on the left side of your screen. Earlier we had only those Wealth tax rules where there was registration of valuers, and valuers were issuing reports under the Wealth tax rule for unquoted shares. Then we had CCI guidelines, where the determination of share premium for a public issue, there were guidelines which were issued. In 1992, I would feel that it was a change setter where we SEBI got introduced, and that's where investment bankers, merchant bankers also got registered, and then we had the additional set of players who entered the field. Even Reserve Bank of India, for FEMA purposes, they brought the guidelines, and they started the guidelines by saying that only one of the methods, which was at that point of time discounted cash flow method, which was allowed to be used for any transaction where foreign exchange was either coming in or was going out of the country. Subsequently, that got changed to internationally accepted methodologies of valuation. And thereafter, if we see, in the year 2017 was the year when the Companies Act section 247 got triggered, and then valuation rules were introduced. And 2018 we had valuation standards from the CA Institute. And as late as a month back, in fact, when the lockdown was on, we had the draft valuers bill, which is introduced, and as I mentioned, it is open for the comment. Now, if once this becomes an act, I think it will be a complete game changer when it comes to the valuation as a profession. Uh, what I get a feel from this change is that the regulator wants now that those who are involved in the valuers should continue to only that as a practice, and not get involved into various other areas of practice. So they want a very focused attention as far as this practice is concerned. And that's where they've provided for some transitional mechanism. So National Institute of Valuers will come into the picture, and thereafter they will register the valuers. So we are saying, as you are aware today, a chartered accountant firm or any cost accountant firm or a company secretary firm, when they take up valuation as the area of practice, it is one of the area of practice apart from the other areas which they are engaged into. I think going forward, maybe decade from now, we will see specified only dedicated valuation firms whose only objective or whose only area of practice will be valuation. So we'll have a very specialized professionals who will be coming up for this profession. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's before we go into the recent changes in the act and the rules and the other regulations, let's very quickly for next 10 or 15 minutes get into the valuation as a basic subject of practice. So what when you are trying to do the valuation, what you are trying to do is arrive at a worth of a particular asset, whether it is a business or a share or a particular intangible asset, whatever is the subject matter of evaluation, you are trying to find the worth of that, and which is a, which is considered to be a fair value for that particular asset. Now there is a misconception. Many times, people feel that whatever is the fair value at that only the transaction takes place, and that may not be right, because in most of the cases, or in many cases, it happens that suppose you give a fair valuation of say 100 rupees for a particular share, it is likely that the buyer and the seller may conclude the deal at either 120 rupees a share or at 80 rupees a share, depending on their negotiation, who is more inclined to pay more, or who is more in distress and he wants to sell it at a discount. Various factors comes into the picture, and thereafter the price gets determined. And valuation is, as you will appreciate, is very subjective, unlike other aspects of accounting or taxation, at least where you have a specific guidelines or standards or sections are available. In valuation, there are certain features in valuations which are very subjective. For example, determination of discount rate, or for applying a multiplier to any EBITDA or a revenue or a profit after tax. Those are quite subjective, and it will differ from valuer to valuer, and each valuer will have his own logic of applying that particular parameter. So it's not uncommon that if same set of data is given to two sets of valuers, they will both come out with different sets of conclusion, and it is not wrong also. Now these aspect, whenever there is a scrutiny on valuation, needs to be understood by the regulators, that there are these subjectivities involved, and as long as the valuer is able to demonstrate that what is the logic he has applied, and is able to substantiate by some backup papers, it should not be a problem as far as regulator is concerned. Then the subjectivity has to be appreciated. Another important aspect for valuation is that it is a date specific. Now you will all appreciate, if suppose we had done a valuation of a company in say first week of March, particularly more in the Indian context, the valuation could have been substantially different as compared to valuation at completely the whole economics, and it could have in fact sort of it could have impacted the entire survival of that company. So to that extent, it is possible that the valuation could be substantially different between the two dates. And I'm giving you an example where we have taken a 2 months gap, but there is a possibility that within a single day also the valuation can substantially change. For example, in the night on a particular day, there is a fire in the plant, and so completely plant is burnt off. Then the next morning, if you do the valuation, it will be that extent. You have to appreciate that whenever valuation is carried out and it is done on a particular day, it is like a perishable item. It may not last for a very long duration. And that's why many of these regulators, when they seek the valuation, they want the latest valuation report and not a very old valuation report. For example, if you go to the Reserve Bank of India for any FEMA related approvals, and today we are in May 2020, if you give them a valuation report which is signed in June 2019, they may ask you to get it updated to the recent date. So typically we have seen that regulators are very particular for insisting a latest report when it comes to the valuation. Next slide, please. Yes. Now this is the slide where I have broadly covered, and friends, this is not an exhaustive list of trigger points for valuation. This is more of indicative trigger points where valuation will be required and it will be called for. So let's start with a business valuation, which the first trigger point could be your restructuring, which could be your mergers, demergers, subsidiarization, any of these kind of restructuring. That means if you are changing the present structure, you will need a valuation, because again consideration will have to be decided. So for example, if two companies are merging and a swap ratio has to be declared, the valuer inputs or opinion will be required by the board of directors and the shareholders, that what is the share swap ratio which they are in their opinion is a fair share swap ratio. So for which one of the very common trigger point is the appointment of valuers and getting the swap ratio, or in case of a demerger it is the entitlement ratio which is called for. Similarly, for purchase or sale of shares or businesses, again valuation is required. The third basket you will see is litigation and family settlement. We are seeing in the last one decade the requirement of valuation for the third basket, which is litigation or family settlement, is increasing substantially. Families are separating, and as the third generation, second generation come into the picture, they want their own set of businesses. They want to independently make their decisions, and that's where they want a separate company for their businesses, and that's where families are separating, and where the primary point of discussion will be the valuation of the two undertakings or three undertakings, and how do you settle amongst the family members. So valuation has become extremely important point of discussion for those environment also. Then we have requirement for fundraising also. When we come to the regulatory basket, we have SEBI, FEMA, Income Tax, Companies Act. So all these regulations which will require the valuation, because all of them they have their own sets of rules and requirements for getting the valuation done. So FEMA, they have said internationally accepted methods. Under income tax, they have Rule 11 UA. SEBI regulation for preferential allotment, takeover code. There are regulations how to value the shares. Under Companies Act, there are as many as 18 trigger points under Companies Act where you need a valuation from a registered valuer. Now, friends, as you know, today they have registered the valuers, which will come to that. That those valuations are required only where it is triggered through Companies Act. Other regulations have not moved to registered valuers. So that means that when it comes to income tax, you don't need to get the valuation done from a registered valuer. It could be a chartered accountant or the merchant banker, as the case may be. Similarly, under SEBI also, they have not changed it to registered valuer. But when we see the draft valuers bill, they want all the acts to appoint a valuer who is registered with National Institute of Valuers. So you will imagine where the regulatory environment is coming from, where they want all the valuations to be done by the valuers who are governed by the particular institute. Today, as we speak, we have multiple sets of regulations requiring multiple, valuers. Whereas we are moving to an era where there will be single valuation institute which will register all the valuers of different classes, and thereafter, under all the acts, wherever there is a requirement of valuation, they will have to carry out the valuation. When it comes to intangibles, we need it for purchase or sale or hypothecation. In fact, now banks have started giving loans against hypothecation of brands or any other intangibles, and that's where valuation of that becomes very important. Or for accounting purposes, particularly when you acquire the intangible, you need to account for its fair value. Or impairment testing. Similarly, financial reporting also, purchase price allocation. When you buy a business, you need to account under various sets of asset heads, and that's where you need to do a valuation, or again for impairment or in-base reporting. So these are various trigger points. Of course, apart from that, there are ESOPs and so many other requirements. But what we have tried to put on this slide are something which is commonly required for valuations. Next slide, please. Now, so which are the different types of assets for which valuation will be required? First and foremost is securities and financial assets, and those chartered accountants or people who are registered as a valuer for this class will know that we are entitled to do the valuation of only financial securities and also intangibles. We will not be able to do valuation of land and building or plant and machinery. There is also another class of valuers who will be jewelry valuers, paintings valuers, sculptures valuers, of course, which is not something which is our domain area. We are more or less, when we talk of a chartered accountant or person with a financial background, we will be more or less concerned with the first two baskets, and other baskets are either done by engineers or other experts in the respective fields. Next slide. Now, very briefly, how this valuation process moves. So first and foremost, when the appointment takes place, you will obtain the information, and very important is you will understand the business. So unlike, just getting the data and putting into a Excel file, first and foremost, any valuer who gets the assignment will have to understand that what business or what is the industry you have to value, and company specific points also he will have to consider before proceeding to selection of methods, or before deciding what weights to give to different methods. First and foremost is understanding the industry and also the company which is required to be valued. Thereafter, the different steps of analysis of specific company and the valuation, selection of valuation methods, and finally the report will come into the play. Next, please. So very broadly, to sort of explain the listeners that what are the information you will seek when it comes to the valuation will be historical data, of course, the latest audited results, industry and company overview, your financial projections for future years. Then there will be a series of discussions with the management on various data, and this could be on surplus assets, this could be on contingent liabilities, various information which you will get. You will need to have a discussion with the management, and just understand the implication of that on the valuation. Then, of course, if it's a listed company, you will look into the stock market quotations, and also it is very important for you to look at the stock market announcements of that particular company. But suppose they've issued some convertible instruments, or there is some announcement about closure of a factory or announcement of expansion plans, all of that will come in the announcement section, because it is possible that when you are valuing the company, you are not privy to the latest audited results, because it may take some time to get finalized. But all these announcements will come helpful to you, because you will know all the entire development of the company ever since the last audited results were out. Then you will also look at some publicly available information, different market surveys, newspaper reports. Only I will here caution the listeners that when you look at newspaper reports, please try to verify the authenticity of the report, because many times these reports are unintentionally, I would say, reported in a very different way. So there you have to be careful that what is reported, is it a right information? So ideal thing will be to go to the authentic data of company's own intimation to the stock exchanges, or if it's a private company, then going to their announcements rather than completely relying only on newspaper report or something like that. Okay, next slide. When you analyze the company, you will have to see what are the strengths and weaknesses of this company. And now in the COVID time, this becomes extremely important, because you may have a capacity but you may not have labor, you may have a market but your manufacturing facilities under lockdown. So there are so many features which now gets added, unlike our normal valuation period. You have to additionally examine and analyze that what are the additional impact which will come because of this current situation. And friends, first of all, we are not at the end of the period, so we don't know when this will get over. It could be 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 3 months. It's anybody's guess as of now. So you will have to take a long-term view that, many times people say, okay, if my factory starts in March, I will be able to make up for the entire year about the profits and all that. Now, whether that is practically possible, you may start your factory, but the clients who have given you order maybe are shut. Many of these textile companies which were selling their goods, exporting to the foreign brands, even if they start operation in India, they will have no work, because all these foreign brands have stopped completely purchases in the current environment. So to that extent, even if you have capability, you may not be able to sell. So these are the some of the aspects, and we will specifically cover it when we look at the slides regarding COVID. But when you analyze a company, you will have to see various factors which can impact more specifically in the COVID environment. But apart from that, also you'll have to historically look at various ratios. For example, your raw material consumption ratios, your working capital ratios. All this becomes very important, because when you look at the projections, unless you have studied the past, you will not be able to effectively analyze the projections and accordingly make a viewpoint on the sustainability of those projections. So your review of the past becomes extremely important. Now, when it's a new company, you cannot issue a review the past because there is no history. In that case, you'll have to see the reasonableness of the future projections which they have provided to you, and then there are parameters whether industry is moving into that particular direction or not. For example, if it's a new company and you don't have history and you are looking at a working capital cycle, and the company which you are looking at is in an industry, say textile industry, I'm again giving an example. In that case, normally the textile industry, the working capital is say 30% of the turnover. Now, the company which has presented you the projections, if they have shown say only 15% of the turnover as a working capital requirement, in that case, you will have to get into more detail that how they are so efficient as compared to the industry. Because once it is a norm of the industry, generally all the players in the industry or all the customers or suppliers of the industry will fall in a particular pattern, and it will not deviate substantially from company to company. There could be certain companies which will have a better contracts with the suppliers or better contracts with the customers. In that case, there could be a reason to believe that the working capital requirement could be different than the industry norms. But as I mentioned, the valuer will have to get into these details and understand from the management and have a substantiation of their claim about certain assumptions. Next slide, please. Now, let us very broadly get into the valuation approaches. Now, we can put this into three baskets. One could be the income approach, second could be the market approach, and third could be the cost approach. Now, friends, under each of these approaches, there could be different methodologies of valuation. For example, under income approach, you can have discounted cash flow method. Under market approach, you can have market price as the method, comparable companies multiple as a method, comparable transaction multiple as a method. Under the cost approach, you can have pure vanilla net assets method, which could be just a pure book value method, or it could be replacement value or realizable value method. Again, friends, this is only an indicative list of commonly used methodologies. It is not something which is like an exhaustive list. You can have multiple variants of this under each of the approaches. Like say, for example, under market approach, you can have revenue multiple also. You can have different parameters. So this is not an exhaustive list, but most of the valuers commonly use these methodologies to evaluate a company. Okay. Now, what are the common adjustments having applied the methodology? And as I mentioned in the beginning, that we will not be able to go into the details of valuation methodologies because the theme of the session is recent developments. But I'm just trying to cover this in a very broad way so that we understand the nuances connected to valuation. So what are the common adjustments which you will do after applying those methodologies to arrive at the final value for a particular business or shares, as the case may be? So it is possible that the company which you are valuing has say 15 investment in its books of account. Now these investments could be pure investment into mutual funds for surplus funds, then it's a different way of handling, or it could be investment in subsidiaries or associates or joint ventures who are engaged in the business in which the company you are valuing is also engaged in. For example, Hindustan Unilever has say 50 investments. All of them are engaged in say FMCG or FMCG related products. Then you can look at it at a consolidated level, Hindustan Lever, rather than looking at individual Hindustan Lever standalone and then valuing all these investments separately and doing sum of parts. So depending on the underlying investments, you will have to take a call as a valuer whether you need to do consolidated valuation or you need to do sum of parts, or it's a surplus investment which you will just add it as a value as like a surplus cash which will get added, like say liquid fund investments or investments in certain bond markets where it is just a short-term deployment of funds. In that case, whatever enterprise value you work out, you add that value to the enterprise value to arrive at the final equity value. Now, so that is on investments. For example, if Hindustan Unilever in our own case was holding some investment which is in say telecommunication. In that case, you have no choice but to value that company, company separately, and capture that valuation in the Hindustan Unilever's standalone valuation or consolidated valuation for FMCG business, and then all non-core investments you will have to separately value and add their value into the valuation of the Hindustan Unilever. So we'll have to, as a valuer, get into more facts and then decide the approach. It is also possible that investment which is at a book value of say 1 lakh in the company's books could be worth 500 crores. For example, that 1 lakh investment in a company which is say wholly owned subsidiary is holding a piece of land in say outskirts of Mumbai, which is very valuable. So we should not go and take a view only based on the carrying value of those investments. We should get into the facts of each company and then take a call that how you want to deal with those investments. Likewise, surplus assets. Many companies have adjacent to their own factory, they have some huge parcel of land which they've kept it just in case they want to go for expansion, or it could be some vacant land, or it could be some factory which is shut down in the past. It could be anything which is not used for the operations of the company. So first, as a valuer, when you seek the data, you will have to find out whether these assets are really surplus assets or they are not surplus assets. Many times I give this example that when you are valuing a company and you have a large parcel of land, and the construction in those lands are in the different parts of the land, unless you are able to convince yourself that you will be able to sell a particular piece of land from that entire parcel without affecting the operations of the company, then it will not qualify as a surplus asset. For example, in the middle of the entire parcel you have a big ground which is empty. It is possible that they will say that this is like a surplus land, but is it practically possible to sell that ground separately without impacting the current operations of the company? That call you will have to take. So it's always better that when the data is provided to you, get into the details, see the drawings, and have a discussion with the operating team members, company people, and then take a final call whether this is surplus asset. Once you are convinced that it is a surplus assets, then you will have to find out the market value of those assets. And being a financial valuer, at times you will have to fall back on some other experts, for example, real estate valuers, and find out the value of those surplus assets, and then you will have to capture it in the main calculation. Again, generally the valuer community takes into account this appreciation on a net of tax basis. However, there are some valuers who take it at a gross level also, but my personal view is that it should be taken on a net of tax appreciation basis rather than taking it at a gross level. Similarly, valuation can get impacted because of the contingent liabilities, or in some cases contingent assets. These are some of these items could substantially change the valuation. So suppose a company like ITC or company like Wipro will have a very huge amount of contingent liabilities where there is some litigation going on either with the old excise cases or with some income tax department, and the litigation is still going on. As a valuer, we'll have to take a call depending on the facts of the case and also pass judgments. And if required, you can obtain an opinion from an expert of that particular field and then take a call about the contingent liabilities. Likewise, there could be some arbitration pending where company is likely to receive some compensation for some faulty supply of raw material. In that case, it's a contingent asset. Again, you will have to get into the details that what are the facts, what is at what stage the arbitration is, and again, if required, you may obtain some legal person's opinion that how good is the case, and accordingly apply a probability. Generally, once the matter, the item is shown under contingent liability, it may not be very correct to take a 0% probability. If you are extremely confident also that this liability will never fructify, still you take a 5% or 10% probability, because cost of litigation also in this country is very high. So even if your case is right, you may have to spend some good amount to come out of that. So at least apply some percentage, even if it's a very good case. Likewise, if a company has any convertible instruments, it could be optionally or a fully convertible instrument. again you will have to capture that on a diluted basis in your calculation, and take into account the impact of that in the calculations. There could be some outstanding warrants, it could be some outstanding ESOPs, or the company may be enjoying some tax benefit and some maybe another 2 years are still pending. Present value of that you may add to the valuation. So these are some of these adjustments, and in a very large corporate, these kind of adjustments can go into 15 or 20 items also, depending on the facts of the case. So your review of financial and facts is very important for you to determine what are the adjustments which will come post you are valuing the business. So that's where many times review of balance sheet, if it is casually done, then some of these items may get missed, and then it can impact your valuation. So my suggestion is that it's very critical that you train the team members how to review the financials of the company and also the subsequent data which is given to the valuer, because that triggers a lot of these adjustments will get triggered from those kind of discussions or from a review of the data. Next, please. Okay, now in many of the conferences, there is a question asked about how to value for mergers. Now, let me give you an example. That suppose Park Davis is merging with Pfizer. That means Park Davis will cease to exist and Pfizer will only continue. So if you are a shareholder of Park Davis, you need to be compensated for this purpose of this merger, and you should be given some shares of Pfizer depending on the underlying valuation. So for example, you are holding 2 shares of Park Davis and the ratio is 1:2. That means for every 2 shares held in Park Davis, you will get one share of Pfizer. Now that swap ratio is based on the valuation which a valuer will carry out, and typically as per the requirement under SEBI and even under the Companies Act, you need to have a valuer who will opine to the management that what is the ideal or a fair swap ratio for the particular merger. Determination of this swap ratio is based on the relative values of the 2 companies which the valuer will carry out. Now there is also a misconception in the marketplace that people feel that once you apply a particular valuation methodology for say Pfizer, you need to identically apply only those methodologies for Park Davis also. By and large, as a valuer, we try to see that we use the same methodology and we apply the similar weightages to these respective methods. But it is possible that in some cases you will have to deviate. For example, if Park Davis was an NBFC and it was merging with a pharma company, say Pfizer, in that case, for an NBFC to apply certain valuation methodologies which is based on a P multiple or a EBITDA multiple may not be very appropriate. In that case, you may value the NBFC using the price to book value multiple or a market price if it's a listed company. And on the other side, you may value Park Davis either by discounted cash flow method or by EBITDA multiple method and or market price method if it's a listed company. So, there is always the possibility for you to change the methodology. The only thing, my suggestion is that don't change this methodology just to suit the requirement. It has to have some logic. Many cases you will have a illiquid stock. I mean, the shares are listed, but it is not liquid or frequently traded. In that case, valuers have given lower weightage to the market price method for one of the companies. So there are these precedents available, and now we are fortunate that you can see all the valuations done whenever it's a merger or a demerger and a listed company is involved. You can see all these reports or all the documents are now uploaded on the stock exchange's website. So earlier in many seminars prior to this requirement, we used to be asked that we want a draft of the report and we want to see the wordings. But now every single report is uploaded on the stock exchange report, whether it is from a big firm or a small firm. So you can look at the wordings of each of these firms. And now another requirement for merger or demerger which has come up by the SEBI circular, that you have to also give value under each method and also weights which you have applied. Prior to this, as a valuer, we were only concluding and giving in the conclusion paragraph only the swap ratio. That means after giving the entire text of the report, we used to just conclude that for every 2 shares of Park Davis, 1 share of Pfizer will be issued. Is a fair swap ratio. But now, as per the SEBI circular, you have to give that Park Davis you have used valued using so and so methodology and giving so and so weight, and Pfizer how you are valued, and those calculations are now part of your conclusion paragraph of the valuation report, which was not the case earlier. So, and in fact, in many of the past cases where valuation was challenged, one of the main points of the litigants were that the valuer has not given any calculation in the valuation report. And all these days, courts had taken the view that, as long as it is done by an independent valuer who is expert in his own field, you don't need to give the calculation as far as the mergers or demergers were concerned. But post this SEBI circular, which came in 2017, thereafter you are required to give the value under each of the method and also the weightages. Nothing wrong in giving. Only thing, sometimes it opens up a channel for minority shareholder to suggest that instead of giving weightage of 2 to the market price, you could have given weightage of 1, and then those kind of messages we receive from the minority shareholder. And since our reports are uploaded on the stock exchanges, sometimes we receive direct communication from the shareholder on our emails or on the phone numbers, and that is one added thing which has happened. Of course, as long as one has not done anything illogical, one should not worry for such scrutiny. But it has increased, some kind of further communication. Earlier, it was happening only at the court level. Now they have started direct interaction with the valuers. So that is as far as merger is concerned. We can go now to the report contents. Now, friends, in 2017, companies rules which got notified, they gave a very clear indication of what should be the content of the valuation report. Now, prior to this, not that we as valuers were not writing this report, these contents, but there were different practices followed by different valuers. For example, in my last couple of years of experience, we have seen some valuers used to give 100 pages report, some valuers used to give only 3 pages report. I have seen one valuation report of only 2 pages. Of course, it was an old report, but what I'm trying to say is that there was no standardization of contents. Some valuers were giving all entire data about industry, company, all specific adjustments in a very great detail. Some were giving in very sort of short form. So now I think with these rules coming into the picture, they've given you the guidelines that what they are expecting and what a valuer should add in the valuation report as a content. This is a new development where, where now if you will see the formats of most of the reports, they will follow these particular guidelines. Contents of each of the paragraphs may differ. Languages, as English being a rich language, it will differ. But the broad guidelines are given to the valuers that this is what they are expecting as a deliverable. So basically, to start with background of the company, what exactly you are valuing, what is the purpose of the valuation? Is it for merger, or is it for individual sale of asset, or is it for a slump sale of business? And who is appointing you? Is it appointment is by board of directors, or it is appointment by a single shareholder, or is it appointment by the bank, or it is appointment by some regulator? Then you have to identify the valuer and who are the other experts. So as I was giving you this example, that in many cases we have appoint land valuers when there is a need for a valuation of surplus land. In that case, you will also have to mention about that expert whose services you have obtained. Now, another thing they have added is that if you have any conflict of interest, so many of these reports now, if you examine on the stock exchanges, some of the larger firms who have multiple areas of practice, they come other services like taxation advisory or some services to this group or this client. However, this valuation team is a absolutely standard conflict of interest in their opinion. So Then you have to also mention the date of appointment, valuation date, valuation report, inspection and investigation undertaken. That means if you carried out some inspection of the plant or if you carried out some investigation, some valuers. Typically, this particular section more applies to the valuers who are doing a real estate valuation or more doing a valuation of plant and machinery. There, for them, this is extremely important point. Then what are the sources of information, what procedure you have followed, which are the whether you have followed valuation standard. And when we come to the slide on valuation standard, I will elaborate on when they want you to write about valuation standards. Thereafter you have conclusion, that what is your pausing for a second. I would like to just tell the attendees that valuation, friends, is an expression of an opinion. It is not a certification. So some of the valuation reports we have seen that they write that we hereby certify that the fair valuation of the company is so and so. Friends, it is an opinion. So you have to say that in our opinion, or if it's an individual's report, in my opinion, the fair value of the company is so and so. Because you can certify a net worth, you can certify a particular net current assets, but to certify a fair value may not be a correct terminology. So generally it is an expression of opinion. So your conclusion paragraph is very important, how you word it. Second thing, if you want to draw the attention of some of the users about a particular adjustment which can have a substantial impact. For example, as I you will have to sort of, yeah, sorry.
Sujal bhai, we missed out. Can you repeat the last sentence?
Yeah. So I'll just say, so conclusion paragraph is very important, because if you want to draw the attention of the user, it is very important for you to mention that in the conclusion paragraph also. So for example, if your business value is say 500 crores and your surplus assets value is say 200 crores, that means it's a critical point of element in the fair value calculation. That in that case, you draw the attention of the reader that this value includes the value of surplus assets as explained in para number so and so. See, ultimately your conclusion paragraph should contain what you want the reader to also read. Or if you have say very high level of contingent liabilities, and as a valuer you have taken a particular call about the contingent liabilities, and you want the reader of the report to know that how you have considered these contingent liabilities, draw the attention of the reader specifically in the conclusion paragraph also, so that whenever he is reading, and with due respect now to the readers or the users of valuation services, only thing they read is the conclusion paragraph. The entire report is hardly read by anybody. So it's better that whatever you want to convey, you please convey at the cost of even repetition in the conclusion paragraph. Thereafter, any major factors which has impacted the valuation, or any restrictions. Suppose you are not given a particular data. For example, company said, I don't prepare the projections. Write that restrictions, that we were informed, and with that restrictions, I'm coming to this conclusion. And finally, the caveats and disclaimers. Now, there is a huge amount of discussion amongst regulators also about the disclaimers which we write. In fact, there are a series of meetings which have taken place where the regulators wants you to sort of they don't want you to write a series of disclaimers. And what used to happen many times, a 7-page valuation report, 3 pages are for the valuation and 4 pages are disclaimers. So regulators of late have started working on it, and I believe some meetings are already taking place between the registered valuer organizations and IBBI to see that what all disclaimers are acceptable and what all disclaimers are not acceptable. And I believe some guidelines will in a short time should come, and that's where it will give a guidance. Of course, if we move to the new valuers bill, it will be a completely different regulatory requirement. But till that time, we will have to see. But for example, they don't want you to disclaim your liability about the projections. Now, that is where how you write about the projections is very important, because Under our chartered accountancy code of conduct, there is a requirement of you that you cannot be sort of party to the, projection, should not give an impression that you were party to these projections, and you can at the most give an arithmetical accuracy confirmation and all those. So within the with the regulations, you have to find a balance of writing about the disclaimers. Next slide. Yeah, now what are the documentation which you will be required to keep? Now, friends, again, as I must tell you now, the more and more valuations are getting challenged. More and more regulators are asking valuers to sort of come and explain, or also take their statements in many of these cases, that how it has been valued. So your file becomes extremely important as a valuer, because it is possible that a valuation done by you in year 2020 may come up for scrutiny only in the year 2025. By that time, the person who were involved in the valuation may have left, or you may not remember some of the factors, why particular factor you have considered in this valuation. So documenting all of this is extremely important, because that only will help you in defending your case going forward. So some of these things which are mentioned on the screen, you need to keep it in your file, duly arranged, duly referenced. So like an audit file, now valuation file also needs to be duly referenced. That means if you have taken a particular adjustment for a valuation, it should have a proper referencing in your data bank, that from where you have picked up, whether you have picked up that data from annual report or your separate calculation, every from whatever is the source of that particular number, you should keep that track, so that you don't have to search at a later date that from where I took this contingent liability of 50 crores, I don't now remember. And then again, you try to go into the cell. Many times Excel being Excel, if you go to the contingent liability cell, you will find 10 plus 2 plus 5 plus 8. Now you don't know after 5 years what was this 10, what was this 2, what was this 5, and what was this 8. So you have to keep that 10 was for excise duty, 2 was for income tax, 5 was for some claims from the suppliers. All of that you will have to keep a separate calculation and then reference it to your main calculation. It's very important now to keep every single calculation duly backed up by even your multiples which you work out, or a discount rate which you work out, the sources of parameters which you use for discount rate. All these you will have to keep it as a separate calculation in your working paper files. Of course, I'll not get into individual items because it's too specific. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Now let's come to the regulatory change, which more like coming to the basic theme of this particular session, that section 247. So when Companies Act 2013 got notified, section 247 was not notified at that point of time. It got notified later, 2017. Where of course they said that any property or shares or any asset which you want to value needs to be done by a registered valuer. Now friends, this is Companies Act, so only this applies only to Companies Act, that it needs to be carried out by a registered valuer. Appointment has to be by an audit committee. If there is no audit committee, then board of directors will have to appoint. Now what is more critical is section 247 subsection 2, where it says the registered valuer has to make an impartial, true and fair valuation of assets. Good enough. Exercise due diligence while performing the functions as valuer. Here when they use the word due diligence, they don't want you to do a due diligence analysis. They want you to be diligent. So they are just saying that you should be very careful in doing your calculations. Make the valuation in accordance with such rules as may be prescribed. Now rules are prescribed, so you have to be as per the rules. Now the fourth bullet is very important. Not to undertake valuation of any asset in which he has a direct or indirect interest, or become so interested anytime during a period of 3 years prior to his appointment as a valuer, or 3 years after the valuation of asset was conducted by him. Now, this is a very, very peculiar situation, whereby first of all, there is no definition of direct or indirect interest. Now, in fact, we also consulted some law firms that exactly what do you mean by direct and indirect. Suppose I am holding 5 shares of Infosys. Will it mean that I will not be able to do the valuation of Infosys, or it is too immaterial for any valuer to look at that parameter? So each firm, we checked with all the valuation firms also. Most of the firms have established their own limits or own standards for adhering to this requirement. That what exactly is a direct interest or what is an indirect interest. Direct interest, I think, is easy, where your father-in-law is the CEO of the company, or your brother-in-law is the CFO of the company. In those cases, there is direct, involvement. But indirect could be, where it's a very vast thing, and there is no clarity on what exactly is indirect interest. So each firm should have their own criteria, and you please document it and keep it. Of course, if required, take an opinion of a law firm and keep it on your record, so that in case any challenge is there, you can substantiate it. Another thing is this 3 years requirement. Sorry, previous slide. Yeah. Another thing is this 3-year requirement. Now, practically, this to sort of follow sometimes becomes difficult, because it is possible that the partner who has carried out the valuation leaves the firm, and after that he will do some assignment. Whether it is applied, 3 years prior to, whether you may have done some small job of, say, tax advisory, whether still you cannot do any assignment. All these questions in the real life are thrown up, and of course we as valuers, we keep on checking with either the law firm or the other valuation firms, that what exactly stand they are taking for such things. There is no very clear cut rule or formula for this, but I think the message given to us through these sections and subsection is that we should be very careful that wherever that you feel, forget the section where you feel that you could, be impacted because of the relationship or interest in that company, you should refrain from doing the valuation of that particular entity. That's a broader message, but of course, within the four corners of law, we have to follow it. Next, please. Now coming to the valuation rules. Now, as we speak, friends, this is something which is prevailing. Now, if the valuer's bill will become an act and it will be notified, which could be 6 months or 1 year down the line, depending on when it will become a regulation. In that case, there will be some transitional arrangement which they provided as far as these clauses are concerned. So as we speak, 2017, these rules, when it got notified, the IBBI, which is Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, was appointed as the agency which will authority to administer and perform the functions under these rules. So that's a paramount agency which is above everything. Thereafter, you have registered valuer organization. Now, the role of RVO is organization which will regulate and impart training to the registered valuer, and also help them to get registered once they clear the exams, and once they have the paperwork in place. They act as an interface between you and the IBBI, between the registered valuer and IBBI, who will also have to register you directly also. So today, if you go to IBBI website, you can find out whether Sujal Shah is a registered valuer or not. Likewise, whether a firm of valuer is also registered or not. All the data is right now on the IBBI website, and to that extent, it is very transparent. So anybody wanting to appoint a valuer, well, we can go and check about the person whether he's a registered valuer or not. And thereafter, you can have a registered valuer, which could be either an individual or a firm or an LLP or a company. He will have to first become a member of a particular RVO, registered valuer organization, and then also register with IBBI. So for example, being a member of Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, I am registered with ICAI RVO. Institute of Chartered Accountants has its own RVO. Likewise, Company Secretary Institute has their own RVO. Cost Accountant Institute has their own RVO. There are other 7 other private RVOs also who are registered. So you can become member of any RVO and then become a registered valuer. It's not necessary that because you are a chartered accountant, you have to go only through ICAI. I know so many chartered accountants who have registered through other RVOs, because their training mechanism was more suitable in terms of timings and all that. So they moved through that RVO. whereas there are other chartered accountants who have gone through ICAI. It's not a rule compulsion that you have to go through your own parent institute. Okay, then how do you become a registered valuer? You have to obtain the educational qualification and experience. You know, in our case, suppose I'm a chartered accountant, I'm a chartered accountant in practice for so many years. That becomes the first thing. None of us were exempted from valuation examination. In fact, the first draft of the rules which came, it had given certain criteria that so and so people will be exempted. But when the final draft was circulated after the public comments, so this was when it was introduced, then they removed all the exemptions, and so every single person had to appear for the examination, valuation examination. It is not a difficult examination, and it is not something which is to be feared about, but one has to go through the training and thereafter clear the exam. And apart from that, also there are certain criteria in the rules for you to become a registered valuer, so that also needs to be satisfied. Next, please. Now, what are the educational requirements which they've given in the rules? Either you can have a bachelor's degree, which, say for example, for ease of understanding, I'll say BCom. So it could be BCom plus 5 years, or it could be postgraduate, which could be MCom. So MCom plus 3 years. Or it could be membership of professional institute, which could be ICAI, Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. So if I am a member of ICAI, I need 3-year experience. If I am a postgraduate MCom, I need 3 years. If I am a BCom, I need 5-year experience. Of course, in addition to that, you have to also complete the 50-hour training course by the registered valuer organization, and also, of course, pass the exam. So, you know, technically, if I speak today, a BCom with 5-year experience who has gone through this course, 50 hours training, and also pass the exam, will also be able to do the valuation. Likewise, MCom and also ICAI or company secretary or MBAs, all of them are eligible now to become a registered valuer. So it has increased the participants, but at the same time, as I mentioned in the earlier slides, it has increased the scope of valuation also substantially. So to that extent, now you know, we have more members to share our knowledge. Next, please. Now, what are the other criteria for the individual? So first of all, he has to be a valuer member of a registered valuer organization. Then he has to be recommended by the registered valuer organization to become a member. He must have passed the valuation examination 3 years prior to application to become a registered valuer. That means I can pass the exam today and apply after 2 years also. That exam is valid for 3 years. He should possess the requisite educational qualification, which is that BCom, ICAI, or MCom. Thereafter, he should not be a bankrupt or he should not be a unfit person. He should be a resident in India. Here they apply the FEMA guidelines for testing whether a person is a resident in India. He should not be a minor, and he should not be of unsound mind. He should not have been convicted, you know, where there is a punishment of more than 6 months. He should not have been convicted for offenses involving moral turpitude, or he should not have been levied a penalty under section 271J of the Income Tax Act for those opinions and other things. So these are for the individuals, these are the requirements. Now, next, please. Yeah, for the firms and LLP, it should be, see, first of all, they don't want any firm or companies or LLP which are subsidiary of another company or associate of another company. So ideally, those firms have to be held by individuals only. So, and starting with the first requirement, it should be set up for rendering professional services, professional financial services. It should not be undischarged bankrupt or going through the insolvency process. At least 3 or all partners or directors, whichever is lower, are registered valuers. Now here there is a catch, I will come to it. At least one partner is a registered valuer of a asset class for which the valuation registration is being sought. Company should not be a subsidiary or a JV or an associate or another company, and none of the partner possesses disqualification as specified for individual. Now, when you go to the individual, previous slide, please. Previous slide. Previous. Yeah. If you see one of the requirement for individual, third one on the left side is pass the valuation examination with 3 years before. So you should have passed the evaluation exam. Now go to the next slide, please. Now, if you see the last requirement, none of the partners should possess disqualification. Now, that means currently when in the IBBI, if you go for registering a firm, although the third box says all or at least three or all partners, whichever is lower should be registered valuer. The last box is coming on the way because then they said that all the partners should have at least cleared the examination. Now, this is creating problem for some firms where it is not a dedicated valuation firm, and there are audit partners also. They also have taxation partners. They have not cleared this exam, nor do they intend to clear this exam. So that means those firms are not getting registered today in IBBA. I believe some representation has already gone. So when we see the valuer bill, this has been corrected. But as we speak today, firms where all partners have not cleared the exam, they are not registering as a registered valuer, the firms. So we'll have to just see how they deal with it. Now, when it comes to valuation conduct, what the rules prescribe is that registered valuer should conduct the valuation in accordance with valuation standards as notified by the central government. Now, as we speak, central government has not yet notified any valuation standards. In absence of central government notifying a valuation standard, what they've given a leeway is either the valuer can follow internationally accepted valuation standards or valuation standards adopted by any RVO. Now, in our case, if I am a member of a CA institute, ICAI RVO has adopted ICAI valuation standards. So I must tell you here that CA Institute worked very fast, and the standard, these rules came in 2017. In the year 2018, CA Institute notified the valuation standards. And that is where those, and ICAI RVO adopted those valuation standards as their valuation standards. So now that is where if you are a chartered accountant, and come to the next slide, please. Next, please. Yeah. Next, yes. So ICAI, when they notified these valuation standards, they said any valuation done by a chartered accountant for a Companies Act valuation from any date after 1st July 2018, you have to follow these valuation standards as adopted by the ICAI. They've also said that if you are doing the valuation for other than Companies Act, you can, it is recommended that you follow these valuation standards. However, it is for Companies Act, it is compulsory to be followed. So the basic purpose of introducing the valuation standards or having the valuation standard is to have a uniformity of approach and quality of valuation output. There is a standardization. As I mentioned, what was happening prior to these valuation standards, not that valuation standards were not followed by the firms, but as I mentioned, everybody was following their own methodology, their own way of attempting a particular method. So now you have at least guidance of how to do this. Beyond the point, valuation standards will only give you the processes and policies and uniformity of that. Ultimately, the subjective part of the valuation will remain the domain of the valuer. You will not be able to have a tight jacket formula for those subjective parameters. There you will have to leave it to the judgment of the valuer, because we will not be able to sort of put this into a very tight jacket basket saying that you have to follow these norms for multiples, you will have to follow this discount rate. Those kind of things will not be able to standardize. That will remain in the domain of the valuers, and it will remain as a final conclusion of the valuer. However, with these valuation standards in place, now we have at least the processes which are standardized. So we are proud that ICAI has notified, which is one of the fastest institute to notify the valuation standards. And as I mentioned, we have to follow this standard if we are doing it for Companies Act. If you are doing it under ICAI banner, that means if I am a CA firm or a chartered accountant also who is a registered valuer, I will have to follow this. But suppose you talk about an MBA, he may follow any internationally accepted valuation standard. Or if you are a company secretary, they don't have to follow these valuation standards. They may choose to follow, that's their choice, but this is not compulsory for them. Next, please. Now, these are the standards which are notified by the ICAI. So, of course, we'll not be able to get into the details of it, but basically, it covers all the important areas of valuation, starting from definitions, the basis of valuation, valuation approaches and methods, scope of work, analysis and evaluation, reporting and documentation, valuation, business valuation, intangible valuation, and financial instruments. Now, these are the things, and so whoever is interested in the valuation field and those who are today not active must go through these standards. They are written in a fairly simple language, very easy to understand, and very easy to follow also. Should not be a problem. Wherever there are requirements of giving additional guidance, CA Institute and RVO comes out with different guidelines for that, and also different publications for that. So it's exactly now working like our accounting standards. So you keep on receiving certain further guidances on each of these standards also. So to that extent, we have standards in place. Now, there, apart from these, various other internationally accepted standards are also there. So you will have standards from UK, you have America, from United States, there are some standards. Some European standards are in place. Australia also, they have their own standards. So you have different standards. By and large, I would feel that tone of most of the standards are similar. But of course, our standards are more India specific. So some of the specific aspects which are required for the country are captured in our standards. Whereas if you refer to some international standards, they may not have those specific touch of India requirements. But otherwise, by and large, broad tone of the standards will be more or less the same. Next. Now coming to the draft valuers bill, which is a new development. And friends, I just want to repeat that this is only a draft stage. Government has just asked our comments. So as a CA, I mean valuer firm or individual valuer or lot of NGOs, everybody will now have to give their comments on or before 28th of May, which is the date given to us to comment on this bill. So today I don't want to get into what is right, what is wrong. I just want to tell you what exactly the framework they have suggested. And then maybe later on you can read these standards in, this bill in detail, and then either individually or through your firm or through your association with whom you are attached, you can give your representation. We have about 13 days left to do that. So basically, what exactly this valuers bill suggests? It says that there has to be a National Institute of Valuers, NIV as we may call. And what is the objective of that? Is to promote the development and regulate the valuation profession, and to protect the interest of users of valuation services. That means users could be regulators, it could be our clients, it could be the person who has appointed you. So one is to promote and develop also this profession, at the same time also to protect the interest of the users of the report. So to that extent, it is a regulatory, like a CA institute, there will be a National Institute of Valuer which will come into the place. Basically, within the National Institute of Valuer, NIV, they will have a governing council like our Central Council of CA Institute. They will have committee of valuers who will be whose guidance will be available to the governing council, and they will have to sort of look at the suggestions given by the committee of valuers. Then there is a valuation standards committee which is proposed, also an audit committee, and there will be an administrative law department which will look into the legal and all the regulatory aspect of the institute. The formation of valuation standard committee will be basically to recommend and also the review. They've also prescribed that every year these standards have to be reviewed, and also some valuation guidelines will also be there under their prerogative. Now this institute also has power to inspect as well as investigate, and they also have powers to search and seizure as we have it under income tax and other regulations also. There is one more feature in this National Institute of Valuer will be there is a possibility of settlement of contraventions, something which is in the consent terms which is there in the SEBI, something very similar. Here also they have provided that the person who has received the show cause notice or likely to receive the show cause notice can go for a settlement of the contravention, and of course there will be some fees which will have to be paid. It is also provided here that there will be a registration of valuers under different asset classes. That is what is proposed in this particular bill, and we'll come to that also. So next, please. Now here, which are the classes of valuer they are proposing? One is there will be valuation entities, which will be this partnership firms, LLPs or companies, which will fall into valuation entities. Then you will have associate valuer. And we come to the requirement of under section 49 in that who are eligible to be associate valuer under the National Institute of Valuers. Then there will be a fellow member, like we have a fellow member, they will have a fellow valuer who will have more than 5 years of experience demonstrating professional excellence of high order. And thereafter they also have one class of honorary member, honorary valuer who has given extraordinary contribution to valuation profession, but shall not be able to render the valuation service. The honorary member will be more like a ornament which will not be able to do the valuation work, but their presence in the overall membership will help the NIV to sort of get their inputs and their suggestions and their valuable experiences. Next, please. Now here, section 49, what they are proposing, I put it into 4 different baskets. So it works like this, that the person who has done the 12th standard, HSC, higher secondary education, and after that, if he has gone through a national valuation program, that will be a dedicated program or education on valuation, then he will be registered as a valuer here. First requirement, first one of the possibilities. Second, if he completed the graduate valuation program. So one is a national valuation program. Now after that, there is a graduate valuation program of the relevant asset class after having a degree or equivalent qualification in the specified discipline. So for example, if I am a commerce graduate or if I am having a commerce background, then I will be able to go through this. So they have sort of now created a roadmap right from your 12th standard. If you are sure that you want to become a valuer, here is the opportunity or the opening which they are going to give you. So instead of you becoming BCom, then you do a chartered accountancy course and then take some experience and become a registered valuer. They have now given a direct focus of this particular line. The third bullet is he has passed the valuation examination of the respective asset class, having experience of rendering valuation services of at least 5 years and having completed the limited valuation program of the relevant asset class. So you have first national valuation program, graduate valuation program for people who are graduate, and the third one is for the existing people who has to do the limited valuation program. Of course, this window is open for next 2 years after the act commences. So that, this is more like a transitional help, that if you are having this category, it should not happen that you have to go back to your normal national valuation program and go through the whole process again. And the fourth basket is it is like today's registered valuers. He has passed the valuation examination of the respective audit asset class, having completed specified hours of training from the valuation professional organization and having specified qualification and experience. Then you have to, this window is open for next 3 years after the commencement of the act. And again, this is more for current RVOs who will be registered valuers who will be taken as an associate member through this mechanism. Let's go to the next slide, which will give the requirement for education. So if I'm getting registered for a plant and machinery and I'm a graduate in mechanical or electrical and so, then I need 5 years post-qualification experience. If I'm a postgraduate, then 3 years. Likewise, in land and building, if I'm a graduate in that respective field of architecture or town planning or so, then I need 5 years experience. If I'm a postgraduate, then I need 3 years. And again, members of the ICAI and all other sister organizations similar to that, you will need a 3 years experience. So to that extent, now they've sort of streamlined this requirement of education also, which was there in the rules also earlier, but now it is more clear. Next, please. How individual can become a registered valuer under the new draft valuers bill? Then it says that he cannot be a minor, he should not be a bankrupt person, he should not be a person of unsound mind. And I'm just hoping that if this lockdown keeps on continuing, we may all get disqualified for the third bullet. The fourth one, he should not be convicted. This was there in earlier rule also. He should not be a non-resident. Again, FEMA definition, and he should not be a fit and proper. That means he will not be a not and fit. So not and not. So he should be fit and proper. Now for the firms, partnership for or the company. Now here, please, friends, you know what they've done. These requirements are for only other than subsidiary, JV or associate. That means if a partnership is a associate of another group or company, that they will not be able to register. Or if a company is a subsidiary of another bigger company, right now this particular slide is do not apply to them. So their primary objective should be valuation. They should not be undergoing insolvency process. Now, third point is important. They have said none of its partners or directors are ineligible. Now, if because in the individual's registration, you don't need here there is no specific need for exam passing as we have in the current rules. Here, all the partners need not pass the valuation examination as required under the current rules, because otherwise, you know, in the current rules, there is a problem of all partners have to clear the exam. Here, it seems they have sort of corrected that position. A majority of partners or directors are valuers. None of the partners or directors are partner or director of another partnership firm or a company which is a valuer. That means you have to be dedicated to one single firm. At least one of the partners or director is a valuer of the asset class for which the partnership or the company is seeking the registration. That means more or less on similar grounds as current rules also. Next, please. Now here the next bullet says that they are going to allow, subject to certain conditions, multidisciplinary firm and also subsidiary, JV and associate. We'll have to wait and watch that what exactly specifications or conditions they bring along when they finally come out with the act. Right now they said you know, any certain safeguards which they feel appropriate, they will get into the sort of they will introduce in the particular act. Now registration and fees section. So that means if you are registered valuer organization, registered valuer, you will be taken as an associate member, and that's what that fourth basket which I showed you in the earlier slide. Now valuer cannot hold certificate of practice if he is in employment. Now this is also currently a problem that, you know, they are not allowing anybody to become registered valuer if he is in employment. They are allowing him to now take the exam, I believe, but they are not allowing him to become registered valuer. So there, you know, here the requirement is that valuer cannot hold certificate. If you are in employment, you will not be able to hold a COP. However, one exemption they have given: if you are a whole-time director of the valuer company, then at least that will not be considered as person in employment, and you will be able to hold the certificate of practice. National Institute of Valuers will be conducting the exam. So it will be like a university who will finally see the quality of the education which the Valuer Institute will impart. So next bullet, I have shown that what exactly is Valuers Institute. Will be imparting the education. Then you have something similar to current RVOs. You have valuation professional organization who will monitor the valuer members to ensure compliance with acts, rules, and its bylaws, and redressal of grievances of user against its members. That will be VPO's job. Now, very frankly, when internally we were debating, we were not very sure that why they need valuer institute separately, valuer professional organization separately, and above all of that, then there is already an NIV. Maybe it is a transitional stage because right now all the RVOs are already registered. At some stage, education and this monitoring which VPO is being prescribed may become function of one single entity, because maybe you don't need two separate agencies as a bridge between the valuer and the NIV. but we'll have to see. As of now, there are two separate layer they've created. Next, please. Now let us come to the most important discussion. And again, I'm just putting some thoughts, friends. As I mentioned at the start, we don't have clarity about what exactly is going to happen to which sector. There is absolutely no clarity even amongst the promoters. Forget the valuers, that how this entire year is going to come up, and not only this year, even going forward, how it is going to impact the company's functioning. Nobody is able to very clearly sort of judge. So what I thought for presenting today, to give you a particular sort of view about industry. And again, these are just some thoughts about the particular industry, and no fixed views of how they will evolve. So we feel is that apparel and textile, if you see, first of all, because of this migrant labor going away, most of this textile, they were quite labor heavy industry, and they need lot of skilled as well as semi skilled labor. Now, having seen these kind of people who are moving out of the state, the respective states where they are working, to their home states, for them to now come back once the lockdown is lifted and to restart the operation, it seems it is a good amount of time which will be required. Apart from that, also there is going to be a problem about the raw material availability, because once you miss a particular season and there is no offtake, again going forward, how you will be able to have the availability of the raw material will be a challenge. Another problem this industry could face is the working capital blockage. Now, if you look at some of these companies, their money is blocked with the foreign customers. Some of these were not LC backed. Some of them I have supplied to an Indian customer who has ultimately prepared a proper garmenting, and then they exported, whose money is stuck. That's why they are not paying to the Indian manufacturer. So there are series of problems with working capital constraint which they will face. Of course, some of the, as Rajesh Bhai was mentioning about the finance minister giving some of the benefits and some of these, packages, we'll have to see how they will impact these kind of companies, because right now seems to be the focus is amongst the labor class and also the MSME sector. The next level of benefits one will have to see, because today there are so many companies, and if you speak to so many promoters, you will find that working capital is going to be big constraint for not only this industry, many other industry. We'll have to see how they come out of their problem, because some of them are not even able to pay their normal April 50% of the wages also. So let's see that. So that is the likely chances for the apparel and textile sector. Now, auto sector, the problem is more because there seems to be going to be a severe fall. Not only in first 2 months, already we have seen there is a severe fall in demand, almost virtually zero operations. But going forward also, now people will think twice before making new purchases. Apart from this commercial vehicle demand may still continue to some extent, but again that also will be impacted because underlying industry also could be impacted. So this sector is likely to see a huge downfall in the demand, and again there will apart from this global recession and also falling income levels, this sector is also likely to be impacted substantially. uh, uh, the construction industry, another problem coupled with other problems discussed earlier, is the most of them are highly leveraged, so their interest costs are very heavy. Apart from that, of course, yesterday or day before yesterday, some extension was granted to them about the completion date, so they will get some extra time to complete the thing. They are also going to face the problem of labor, because most of the labor involved in the construction industry for the half constructed projects could have moved out of the state or the place where the construction is going on, and that is where again serious problem of them coming back and the construction restarting, coupled with a serious problem of demand. and the lowering of the prices is likely to impact this industry again substantially. Another very worst affected could be aviation and tourism. As you will appreciate, friends, that in aviation industry, in fact, some of the companies will get wiped off at a global level, I'm saying. And also some of the companies, even if they start, they will find it very difficult to sort of sustain, because one is that demand will substantially fall, certain sectors will get shut down. Even if it starts in the lockdown 4, we'll not know whether it will start fully or only for some sectors, again from red zone to or green zone, whether it will travel or only between two green zones it will travel. We don't know exactly how it is going to impact, but in a long time to come, people will travel less. And now frankly we are used to this kind of now electronic meetings. So earlier also for some small meetings, people used to travel within the country. Also business is also now with cost cutting, they will think whether a person needs to physically travel or it is possible to go through the. So a lot of these things will get impacted, and tourism badly will be impacted because people will not take chance right now to go abroad and vacation. So you will see a very severe drop in this particular industry. The industry which may get benefited or at least will be able to float better could be FMCG, because essential commodities may not get impacted, as we have seen that they are requiring a constant supply, and items of daily use like soap and toothpaste, and those also demand will be constant if not more. So that sector may not be impacted as badly as the other sectors. Again, pharmaceutical sector may see a upward trend, because some of these companies will be able to supply to, I mean, the requirement will be to supply to this infected disease, and that is where you may see some of the companies, they may do extremely well. No, but frankly, nobody will be able to very definitively say that this is the going to be the impact. Because the other day I was reading in the newspaper that you may see a severe increase now in the requirement for dishwashers, or requirement for some of these electronic gadgets, because now people may need it more as compared to the earlier time. So all of us will have to wait and watch that how this will impact a particular industry, and why this analysis is very important. Because when we go to the next slide, next slide please. Yeah, see, first of and foremost, you will have to see that whenever a company comes to you for valuation right now, and mind you, friends, today
Huh?
most, sorry, there is
Koro
some
koro?
disturbance, Rajesh. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So whenever now companies are going for coming for valuations, most of them are either coming for impairment testing for their investments, or they are coming for some proposals are also floating now for complete sale also, because some promoters are feeling that now we will not be able to restart the operation, so instead of that, let us sell the company or business. So those kind of things are coming up for valuation right now. Large M&A deals have substantially dried down, but uh, whenever a company approaches you or a management approaches you for a valuation, first of all find out whether the industry or the specific company is first of all in a position to restart, or it is not in a position to restart. Some of them have already started the operation, so you will have some benefit of actuals also, 15 days or so. So first and foremost, you will have to find out whether it is going to be a going concern valuation or it is going to be a liquidation valuation. If it is a going concern valuation, then only we can think of what will be the maintainable profit or what will be the future cash flows. If it is determined or it is certain that it is a liquidation valuation, then might as well start looking at the asset base of the company and see what kind of value it will fetch if it is sold. Again, today, the market is such that if you have a large parcel of land, there may not be very strong buyers available in particular some of the areas. Or if you have a very good machinery also, there may not be. In the earlier times, yes, industry was doing well and some competitors were interested in the machinery. Now they may not be interested in the machinery. So even liquidation price could be impacted. Of course, most of that call will have to be taken by the engineers and the plant and machinery valuers, our role could be limited unless it is for intangibles or some financial asset. But otherwise, more or less will be dependent on the real estate valuer. So first and foremost, we will examine whether it's a going concern or not. Secondly, you find out the industry in which it operates, the nuances of the industry. But friends, don't look at only the industry, also go into company specific, because a particular FMCG industry may do extremely well, but the company which you are valuing may have products which are not suitable, or where the fall of the requirement is substantially high. So in that case, it may not be in the same line as FMCG industry, but it may be different, or it could be the other way around also. So specific industry analysis and the company specific impact analysis of the current situation is very, very critical. Now, if you are following income approach, that means discounted cash flow method, then your sort of biggest review point will be the future cash flows, starting with the year 2021. So if you are having a projection for next 5 years, you will have to literally discuss line by line the assumptions taken by the management and see whether they have taken the impact of COVID-19 appropriately. Again, it will be the best judgment of the current situation. And that is where, and the last point I'm going to touch upon, that what all care you should take in writing your report for such situation. But the best judgment on the cash flows will have to be done. But don't blindly rely. Otherwise, also we don't rely on the projections blindly. But please have a extremely careful examination of these projections, and also probe on every single assumption, because a single item of variable may impact the valuation substantially. As a valuer, we will have to take a call on the discount rate or extra risk which you may want to put because of the current situation. That will be left entirely to the judgment of the valuer, whether you want to say, after arriving at a normal discount rate calculation, you want to add say 2% or 3% as a separate discount for a particular case, or you want to adjust in the beta, or you want to adjust in the equity risk premium. Different valuers follow different mechanisms to capture this risk, but by and large the message is that as deemed fit, the valuer will have to capture this additional risk because of COVID in the factors which are under the control of valuers, namely the discount rate or any other overall adjustments which you may do even for multiples, because same adjustment applies even to multipliers also. When you apply a multiplier using the past data, the past multipliers could be very good, because it may not have fully captured the impact of COVID impacted prices. But going forward, your call about the first the maintainable level of profits of the company, and secondly the multiplier which you will apply to that particular company, both will have to be appropriately after appropriately capturing this COVID related extra risk. So I have seen some valuers, will suppose the normal multiplier is 8 EBITDA. They will reduce it by say 20% or 25%, saying that in the current situation, difficult to estimate the impact. So we are reducing the multiplier by 25%. Or after arriving at the value under each method, they may discount it by 25% or 20% or 10%, depending on their judgment. The value, saying that the exact impact of COVID is yet to be sort of known. In fact, some of these annual results which are getting declared, you will see some auditors have started putting note about COVID, that we have taken the impact of COVID as we signed today, and what we felt along with the management, what is the best appropriate impact. But it is likely situation that actual impact may be far different than what we have captured. So they are also putting a disclaimer. Likewise, you will also have to write in your valuation report that, although we have captured the impact of the current situation to the best of our ability and understanding, however, the actual impact could be far higher or far different than what we have captured. So that kind of disclosure in the concluding paragraph or in your disclaimer somewhere, you will have to draft and start writing now, because reader of the report, whether it is an auditor or it is a user for the actual transaction, should know that you have tried your best to give the impact, but it could be materially different than the actual reality. Uh, the problem is we are still going through this problem. We have not yet, the problem is not yet behind us. Problem, we are in the middle of the problem, and the likely chances of opening up also nobody is able to very clearly tell. Because suppose they open up the from Monday onwards, the entire lockdown is lifted and people start going to the offices and workplaces, and tomorrow if there is again an outbreak, they may start again a lockdown for another 40 days, who knows. So we'll have to wait and watch how this is going to impact. But please, whenever you are now doing any valuation in the post COVID situation, first and foremost, examine the industry, see the impact on the company also. Whatever assumptions you are taking for projections, please thoroughly probe it and see whether they are looking reasonable. And again, make an appropriate disclosure in the report or the your disclaimers, as the case may be, or concluding paragraph, to make sure that the reader gets the right message. I think that ends the presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions, and I'll request Vitang also to help me to identify the questions on the subject.
Thank you, Sujal bhai. Till Vitang identifies some question, there are 2-3 questions which are being put on the post. Can you throw some light on the startup valuation? How do you get into the startup valuation?
Yeah, so see, when you say a startup, that startup will either have a product or a plan in place. That means, it could be a startup by say to IIT graduates, and they have a design or plan in place. Only thing they don't have is the money to scale it up, and also they are not sure about the future. So whenever somebody is doing a startup valuation, of course there are number of methods which are evolved in the recent past about startup valuation. But my personal view, maybe I'm little traditional in that way, that ultimately the proof of the pudding is that any business in the long run has to give back the cash flow to the owners. It cannot be a sustainable unit if it continues to have a negative numbers. So beyond the point, otherwise it will become passing the parcel game, and at some stage either the public at large or the bankers or the large private equity investor will become the recipient of that baggage, which will not be able to realize that value. So ultimate proof of the pudding is that it has to start either giving you the EBITDA or the cash flows, as the case may be. So in the long run, you may use any other methodology. I've seen some startup valuation, they use advertisement spent into some particular multiplier, or number of account holders into a particular multiplier, or next 2 years HR budget into a particular multiplier. Those kind of methods, you may use it as a cross check, but ultimately it has to result into a discounted cash flow value. And also, while discounting a startup, using a discount rate for startup, you have to appropriately capture the risk of its failure also, because in startup you will not find a comparable company. Most of these are unique sort of products or plans, so you will have to appropriately capture it in your discount rate, this particular aspect about the risk involved. So I have seen some valuers using as high as say 30% discount rate for a startup calculation, because they feel that normative discount rate could be 16%, but here I want to capture the higher risk. However, I have seen some reports which are using this, sort of surrogate methods of valuing the startup. But as I mentioned, these methods ultimately may give you a number and it may satisfy the investor, but whether it is right for the investor to invest at that value, only time will only tell. So being a person who is always taught conservatism, sometimes those methods I use it or see it only as a cross check rather than the main method.
There is one interesting question. If for buyback of shares of a private limited company, there is no valuation method prescribed. So when a buyback is in section 77 of the Companies Act, and a company which is very high on the asset, the NAV can be very high. Can a discounting factor be taken to come to a realistic picture for the buyback?
Yeah, so it is not necessary that a company's valuation will be it has to be higher than the net worth of the company. So there are so many companies today who are listed in the marketplace where net worth is far higher as compared to the overall market capitalization. So sometimes the PB ratio is 0.5 also, sometimes the PB ratio is 0.75. So it will be appropriate to take into account the discount. But I would suggest, instead of getting into the base of asset based calculation for a going concern, if it's a company which has its own operations, then use the EBITDA and apply a multiplier to that. Now, whether that results into 0.75 times of the net worth or 0.5 times of the net worth is something which will be the result. But you don't need to then keep asset as a base, because of course, as you rightly mentioned by you, there is no methodology which is prescribed and people are using different methodologies. But it is better that once you are offering the price for buyback, you should also not overprice it, because tomorrow then the residual shareholders will be left with the company with low asset base with low profitability also. Because many companies, you will find that earnings do not throw the value which is equivalent to the asset values also. If you particularly look at some of these hotel companies, it is possible that the asset values are far higher than the EBITDA or the profits which they generate. Yes.
Vitam, would you like to take few questions for Sujal Bhai?
Yeah, sure. So actually there are 55 questions right now, so definitely we can't cover many questions out.
You take 5-6 which are very relevant as per your experience.
Sure. So the first question is from Amit Sawant, that any guidance on the risk-free rate and the market return to be taken now for calculation of cost of equity for DCF workings in current scenario?
No, so one is that, of course, risk-free rate is something which is as a available data. As I mentioned during the last slide, that equity risk premium, there are valuers who are right now adjusting either at the equity risk premium level or at the end after working out the discount rate for capturing that extra risk. Different valuers have their different way of capturing it, but I have seen most valuers adjusting the discount rate at the end after arriving at the overall discount rate. Then they are capturing it as additional business risk in the current situation. But he is right that some valuers are also adjusting the equity risk premium also, and I would not say that it is a wrong proposition.
Okay. The other question is, what is the general timeline to maintain the documentation for valuation assignments? And the other is that for how long is the validity of a report which has been issued?
See, there is no fixed rule about the validity of the report. That this report is it's like a normal medicine, that this expiry date is 15 days after the issuance of report. It generally depending on the purpose, you may take a call that there are certain reports which are valid only for a week. After the week, it will not be of use. But suppose you can use a 3-month-old report for a particular transaction. So depending on the transaction and the requirement, like I was mentioning you about the FEMA requirement, many times RBI will come back with a query. If your report is say 3 months old, they will say, no, give me the current report, because they want to see that current issues are also captured. Whereas in many of these merger cases, when you issue a report and finally it goes to the regulator scrutiny, there is a time lag of say 5 months. Then also it is accepted. So there is no fixed rule about the validity of the report. When it comes to the report records maintenance, the rules provide for the record maintenance, and if I'm not wrong, it is at one place it is 3 years, and in the standards I think it is 8 years or so. So higher of the two we have to maintain if you are a chartered accountant. So there is also another thought process, because under the income tax there is another requirement. Suppose you have issued the report where there is a transaction which has taken place. So people are also taking a call that you have to take the requirement of income tax for keeping the document, because I think that's the highest amongst all. So each valuer has its own thing, but I think by and large, once you follow the rules and standard, it should be good enough.
Okay. The next question is, what about a firm where different partners are registered under different RVOs? Which valuation standards are to be applied?
Now, if the firm is registered through the ICAI RVO, you will have to follow the ICAI RVO guidelines. But I think from the question, I understand that there are different classes, and ICAI RVO, which is maybe the only RVO which has prescribed their own standards. In your fact pattern, it seems you have a land valuer also, plant and machinery valuer also, and financials. So they could not have gone through ICAI RVO. Then that means maybe it is registered through sort of other RVOs, which are for all the three categories, and there you will have flexibility of following the internationally accepted standards.
Just a second.
My good friend Shavak has written some question which is there on the screen. So let me read it. Sir, where you have a multiple that you use derived from the market P every time is in this an example of the market approach, the income approach, or we may state that it is both. This is where the approach is intersect. Intersect. So Shavak, this is where if you now go through the standard, any method where they use a multiple which is derived from the market, it falls under the basket of market approach. I remember traditionally firm used to call this as an income approach also, but now if you read the standard, these methods which you have put it on the screen are all market multiple methods. So you are right to an extent. Originally there was this intersect where people used to call this as income or market approach, but now I think now it has got standardized and everybody calls it as market approach.
Okay, one of the questions is that whether limited liability partnership firms will be allowed to be registered registered valuers
in the new valuers bill, or you are
under the new valuers bill.
Yes, it will be allowed, subject to those conditions where it should be formed for only valuation services and all that. So partnership firm, when they call, they also, it includes a limited liability partnership firm also. So it is wide enough. In fact, now it is the new valuers bill is wide enough for all the categories.
Okay, one of the questions is from Mr. Saurabh Soparkar. Question is restricted to M&A situations. It has been observed that swap ratios are worked out in our terms of one share to be issued by the transferee company vis-a-vis number of shares of 3 transferer a company, which leads to complicated fractional entitlements. Is there any practical hindrance of working on the other way around, which is n number of shares to be issued by the transferee company vis-a-vis 1 or 10 or 100 shares of the transferee company, which would avoid such complications?
So I'm not fully understood the question. So what it says that today you are issuing, you are saying that for X number of shares of transferor company, Y number of transferee shares are to be issued.
Which leads to fractional entitlements.
Which leads to fractional entitlement.
So whether the ratio can be in a manner which can avoid fractional entitlements.
Yeah, one is that of course there is no problems writing it that way, but now with the most of the shares in the demat form, there is the fraction entitlement, if any, will be very low also, because earlier there was this lot system and all that. Now even one share is a lot, so fractional entitlement is very low. But I don't see any challenge in writing it the other way around also. Because there you will write for so and so shares, ultimately the relative values has to match. So as long as that matches, I don't see any issue in writing that way also. But it's a unique question, so let me also apply my mind, and I think I'll also speak to him also. Yes.
Sujal, I can answer that.
Yeah.
So, sir, any whichever way you write, as long as ratio is not 1:1, it is going to create fraction. Even if you write other way around, also it is going to create fraction. So suppose the ratio is fair, based on the fair value, the swap ratio comes to 4.25. So 4.25, whichever way I write, it is going to create a fraction. Whether I say for every 425 shares, 100 shares, or because people will not be holding shares in the same proportion as you write the ratio. So whichever way you write, fraction will come.
Okay.
Yeah, Sujal, go ahead.
And one of the last questions which we can take it is that what is your view on the market risk premium to be considered for cost of equity during this unprecedented times?
No, so that there will not be a single answer to that. I think it can vary from situation to situation. Uh, but as I mentioned, that valuers after examining the projections and taking the impact of COVID, they are adding. Some valuers are putting 2% extra risk. Some people are taking 5%, depending on the underlying risk which you perceive. You will have to, there is no fixed answer. In fact, by giving a fixed answer, you will be misguiding the attendees. So it is avoidable, because every valuer will have to take a call that what is more appropriate additional risk which you want to put because of these current conditions.
Okay. And so most of the questions which have been put in are very valuation specific for whether certain adjustments can be worked out or not. So I think so
what we
that you
can do
can
is
take
that
it
if
over
these
email.
questions can be retrieved, we can go through these questions and maybe give it to the chamber with our views on that, and then they can in some mechanism they can circulate it to the participant. I'm not sure Rajesh bhai will be able to sort of answer on that.